So yes, I'm going to share a little bit about my experience as a little bit of a whistle-stop tour. And I wanted to ask this question: are startup founders born or made? Now, on some level, I think I've always wanted to be an entrepreneur, a founder, an innovator, creating interesting things. And even as a kid, I always had some sort of money-making idea, whether that was making perfume made of rose petals and sell it to my elderly neighbours, which my mum was mortified about and made me give back all of the money immediately. Or selling the things that you couldn't find in the tuck shop that you wanted at school, selling it for a bit of a profit on the side. And I even used that typewriter to write business plans in the cupboard under the stairs that I now said was my office. What a weirdo. That led me on to interface design and a little bit of programming, and I met my arguably best mate and long-term co-founder, Kev Price. And we decided in the early noughties that we would set up a web agency called Key Media, which people could neither pronounce nor spell, incidentally, never get us to name anything. And we worked really, really well together, so that was a really good shout. We wanted to build awesome things. We did. We had a couple of projects lined up. It was all really going really well, and we were going to build these awesome things on the side. And the world celebrated by having a global credit crunch. But hey, we made it work. And for 6 years, we built some awesome things for other people, but we thought it was time that we built something for ourselves. Now, we'd heard about the Ignite Accelerator, known as Ignite 100, back in 2013. And we saw this as a chance to turn our startup idea into a venture capital-backed business in 3 months through extensive activity. So we applied, and we were successful. Now, again, this was back in 2013, so just to set the scene for that, the word of the year was selfie. People were getting very excited about turning lists into articles and calling them listicles. And Twitter mostly looked like this. A simpler time. It's okay, fell whale. Don't look, Twitter's fine. But Kev and I were talking about the future of video. What if we could sync up Twitter chatter and video together and use that to understand moments in video? This will get very meta, this talk, because long-term attendees of Thinking Digital might think that that does sound really familiar. That's because we were actually finalists in the startup competition in 2015, and we worked on the Thinking Digital Livestream for a couple of years afterwards. And our tech, Reframed, would capture all of the tweets on a live event or a talk and sync them around the video. There's some very clever tech and an interface that I will not bore you with, but it was a way of bringing all of that together so you got that live experience. And that might sound like time-commented, time-stamped comments on videos might seem pretty generic and normal, but it would be 2 years before YouTube, and for the gamers among you, Twitch, would actually use that. As I said, we had this very extensive algorithm behind it, so we could actually take up to about 2,000 tweets a second and make it feel like Twitter was not assaulting you, which was no mean task. But we'd also track all of those tweets on the timeline so that you could see which ones were the big moments. And lots of people thought this was really cool, including Twitter. And we'd often meet with them, and they'd share some of their ideas, we'd share some of ours, and they'd give us access to all sorts of tools that not everybody got access to straight away. And they weren't the only ones. We worked with the BBC, ITN, and we were in very, very early talks with things like ITV Player and 4OD. But although lots of people thought it was very cool, including Herb, our growth wasn't quite happening quite as fast as we wanted. And where was this hockey stick-shaped graph that every startup dreams of? Well, the crux of the issue was that whilst the viewers liked it, especially conference audiences like Thinking Digital, who are highly engaged on social media, clever, deep thinkers, very attractive. Particularly when live tweeting was very much in vogue. The people that were using it were never going to be customers, because customers are people that pay you money. And as cool as that was, no one was going to pay us to have that sort of experience. So we had to focus on the owners of the video, the people that were using that for our sort of business model. But of course, lots of people use video for lots of different purposes. And every time we'd find a use case, we'd build a subtly different set of features, that often a distinct user group, and try to convince them that it solved a problem that they didn't often really care about. And so we had like sentiment analysis for people wanting to understand the nature of what was being said. And we had reports for those people that wanted to know which were the most interesting talked about moments that resonated with people. But coming up with a coherent business proposition for each one of those took time. Because we didn't know which one of those features and which one of those audiences was going to give us that epic growth that we dreamed of, we had to try all of them. But we did realize that what most people, excuse me, that have video want to do is monetize it. So we built something for that too. And the USP here was that we could choose the exact time that an advert would appear next to a video without interrupting it. You might argue how important that was, which is a fair point to make, but this is the track that we took. And it could be highly targeted, so it could be linked to something that was happening in the video, or sell tickets for Thinking Digital. And of course, that would come up with its own set of features, which we were going to really enjoy building. So whilst we were doing that, we found somebody else that would come and help us supply with those ads and help us collect all of that revenue. What could go wrong? Because it had taken longer for us to find a repeatable business model than we'd thought, it was hard for us to convince new investors that we were that one deal that they could not afford to miss. And we were running out of money. So you can imagine how excited or possibly relieved we were when our ad partner, the one that had been selling all of these ads to advertisers, revealed that he was actually an investor and he wanted to invest. And look, it made sense, right? Because he'd seen how effective it was. Every day he'd be bringing us a new deal from a new advertiser. This was working. To cut a very long story short, though, it turned out he wasn't actually an investor. He didn't have any money. He also hadn't been selling us ads. He'd just been making them up. So we were never going to get any of that revenue. And so I'm just realizing people hearing this story for the first time. It's a good one from the outside. And then because, of course, we thought we were collecting revenue, proving a business model, we hadn't, which made finding investment really difficult at that point. And of course, the revenue we were expecting wasn't real. So we went from everything is awesome to our company is dead in a few short weeks. Now, there's a lot of lessons that I learned from that experience. Too many to share today, but I just wanted to pick up a few that I think will probably help a lot of people, particularly if you're thinking about being in startups. And the first one was this. We started with a solution. And that solution was an interface that we sort of retrofitted a business model around. And of course, when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So if someone had a problem with video, we'd find a way that Reframed would probably fix it for them. And we spent lots of time trying all of those different use cases and building those features for each one. But we weren't willing to scrap or fundamentally change that premise of the interface. So we kept chasing this dream of an audience, of a customer that possibly wouldn't have existed. And what we should have done is start by understanding the problems that our target audience, content creators, actually experienced, and then focused around the biggest ones, the ones that kept them up at night. And only then should we focus our effort on finding the best solution to fix that one that really suited our customers. Because people don't pay you for features or cool. They pay you to solve a problem for them. And the best way to do this is essentially applying the interactive cycle of the scientific method to business. Now, not a scientist, so I might get this wrong. But for those of you that are not familiar with it or need a little bit of a reminder, you basically form a hypothesis, test it by performing an experiment, analyze that data, interpret it, and allow that to inform a new hypothesis. The idea is to basically have an idea and make sure that it's real. Do customers want this? Yes, with evidence. To be fair, we sort of knew this, but the problem was we skipped to building a minimum viable product. And we did build an MVP. We didn't start with all of those features. We're actually pretty good at it. But we did skip to product. And what we should have done was a series of minimum viable tests. We should have designed the smallest, quickest experiment that we could and start testing each hypothesis in turn. Because when you're performing an experiment, you can collect data. And building a product without data, or a business, is like driving to a destination with your eyes closed. Dangerous. Often this is as simple as just talking to people, or more accurately, listening to what they tell you. And if you're solving a real problem, you'll be surprised with how little a feature set you'll actually need before they can start using it, and you can start collecting this data quickly. Now, people often think about MVPs or MVTs in terms of product, but you are not just building a great product, you're developing a business around a product. And a founding team in a product-led tech startup needs to consider sales and marketing. They aren't just product owners. I like to think about this as like building a machine where you have lots of small cogs that all need to work perfectly together in order to scale. And startups need to scale. They need to consider distribution as much as product. And so the minimum viable tests also need to be applied to some of those assumptions. And then made sure that you keep testing to make sure that they work efficiently together. Now, with all those little cogs working together, there's loads of ways that those can go wrong. And often the things that you really need to test are the scariest things to find out aren't true. So our minds are very good at ignoring them, like, is your investor actually an investor? Are people actually going to pay for your product? Now, it's a lot easier to see some problems from the outside than it is the inside. And sometimes we just need someone else to tell us the thing that we would have told anyone else coming to us. And actually, if you think about any group, any cultural scene that's ever happened, whether that's the Renaissance, maybe your favorite music genre, or indeed Silicon Valley, usually something happens to bring a group of like-minded, often creative people together who challenge and inspire and support each other, often with the sum of amazing results. Now, Brian Eno, the musician, calls this Esenius, which he defines as the intelligence and the intuition of a whole cultural scene. It's the communal form of the concept of genius. And look, we had our first test. Well, do you know what? I was going to say the first taste of this with Ignite, but arguably the Thinking Digital community is also Esenius, right? But when Reframed closed, it was painful, really painful. I mean, it had been our public persona. We'd brought it to things like this. But it was the community around us that supported us and valued our experience and asked us to share everything that we'd learned. And we learned a few things about due diligence. Now, in some ways, I've come full circle because now I run the Ignite Accelerator that gave Kev and I that amazing first adventure in tech startups. And at this point, I've worked with over 100 early-stage tech founders across those programs. In fact, 2 of them will be pitching in the startup competition later on today. And despite working in the tech startup world for the last 11 years, I can't tell you which ideas are more likely to work or not. But I've got a lot better at telling you which founders are more likely to do better. So, what do I look for? Well, I look for this idea of being problem-focused, doing small tests, looking at the scary thing within their business, and how much have they surrounded themselves with something like Esenius that will help challenge and inspire them. So, back to this question. Are founders born or are they made? I was clearly born with an appetite for this kind of challenge, but would I have always been successful? I don't think so. Whilst winning gives you confidence, it's the failure that gives you the understanding. And it's only by understanding can you actually proceed with intention. I wasn't born a founder, I was made through experience, through failing and getting back up again, trying again, and the support of all of the community around me. And if that's true for me, I think that's true for everybody. Thank you very much.
Fascinating. Because I know at least some of the history, it's amazing to remember some of the things that have gone on. But let's take it to the present. So you mentioned obviously this idea that founders are made, not born. Although I imagine some are born and they start closer to the promised land.
That write business plans as a 7-year-old.
Indeed, yeah. So in terms of the folks that I imagine at least a significant percentage do come in with solution already at least in mind, if not on laptop, if you will, right? So in terms of like getting folks across, I think you mentioned in conversation, you have at times this magic moment where you suddenly realize they get it. Sometimes after weeks and months, if not longer, the penny seems to. So what are you observing at that time when you think, oh, they've crossed the chasm into where we need them to be or want them to be?
Yeah, there's two. Well, there's a funny answer and there's a real one. Funny answer is they usually do a buzzword bingo card and they start spitting back my own messages at me.
Okay.
But there seems to be a moment where they sort of go back to their original hypothesis. Well, there is a pivot. I mean, it's a little bit of a cliche, but for a reason. And sometimes it can be a small thing. It can be like they've realized that there's a niche audience that has this. But just going back and usually there's something that they didn't know that they didn't know. Mm-hmm. And then they create a whole new business around that. And from the outside, it can look really subtle, or it can look like people are flapping all over the place. But there's a moment where they just go, that's not going to work. What is? Okay. And that's a really important turning point for me, because then I feel like we've built a founder at that point in time. It's their job to go and create the business. Okay. But at that point, they've got the questions. Interesting, yeah.
So it's almost, I guess, a kind of mindset change where they become less committed to solving the problem as soon as possible, or already have the answer to this issue. Is a kind of, I guess, a learning mindset is a thing that you might, so to kind of have that humility of asking the right questions. And another question, one of the great things that, as you'll know over time, is that yesterday was great evidence of the kind of increasing breadth and depth of the startup community here. I mean, with this 11th startup competition we've done, and I would say many of the previous 11, we've had to really cast the net nationwide. Occasionally, internationally, we've had folks from France and the Netherlands come over as well to be part of the competition. And would you recommend that anybody or everybody possibly try to do some form of startup activity? Maybe not everybody, but a lot more than currently do.
I think there's this idea, well, yes, I guess, but nuance. That's one for the buzzword bingo. Nuance, because what is that sort of activity? Like, if everyone has a side hustle or an idea, but the problem is they decide it needs to be really big. It's not this small minimum viable test. It's this whole big thing that they need to do. I'm going to quit my job and I'm going to do this thing. Terrible idea. Please don't do that. Test it first. And actually, quite a lot of the most successful startups that I've worked with or I've seen started off as a side hustle, and they had the evidence, and it built the momentum to a point where there was this pull away from something else. Yeah. And actually, because technology has moved on, and obviously like the boom of like AI in the last 18 months or so, it means that actually it's a domain expert can now build an app. Mm-hmm. We'll hear about one of those later on. A domain expert can find a problem, and then they know how to fix the problem from within. The technology is a tool to do that. Whereas in the past, again, it was like that hammer. How can technology fix that problem? Sometimes that's not the way to do it.
Yeah.
So being a domain expert, you can often find like a very subtle way of fixing that problem and then building a product out, rather than thinking like a product owner or someone that likes building tech and just, what's the coolest thing we can build here? So, yeah.
Okay. No, the only reason I bring it up is just because it seems to be one of the advantages of, it's almost even besides about thinking about making a successful startup, which is obviously the short-term point, or maybe short to medium-term point, but it almost, no matter what happens when you come through it, you may well adapt a way of thinking about just life generally that is applicable across multiple domains and multiple experiences going forward into the future. And just because, modern life in a relatively wealthy place like the UK or the US and these first world places is that it just seems like most things, whether it be formal education or normal, if you will, jobs, you can escape the vice of real pressure. Whereas like with a startup is like, if you don't get this right, then you will fail, and you will fail in a undeniably public way, which I think is, while painful for many, is also probably quite healthy.
I mean, it doesn't have to be as painful as that.
Yeah.
And that's where the minimum viable tests come in.
Yes.
Right? So working out if people want it first and then building for that. And each thing within it is a really good way of doing it. Before you quit your job, make sure there's something that you're going to. But more than that, make sure you're going to like what that thing is going to look like.
Sure.
Because you don't have to be any type of startup founder. Like, it's your business. And if it's your business, you're the one thing that can't change. So you should prove it to yourself as much to anybody else. It's your life. You can make more money.
Sure.
You're never going to get back more time.
Yeah.
So that's, I think, the mindset, and you can apply that to anything. Yeah.
It brings us back to Tom's first presentation, really. Listen, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.